Madam President, you may know better than I with regard to the small modular nuclear reactor. I believe there had been a lot of interest expressed by Holtec on having such a design implemented on the Oyster Creek site. Have you heard anything on that recently?
So I've certainly heard of interest. The challenge I think that we have seen with small modular reactors and just this is a conversation that I've also had with the Department of Energy at the federal level, because we have been wanting to figure out how best to expand nuclear if at all possible, is that SMRs have not yet been developed. There is a model, a computer model, models on paper. There has not been an actual SMR developed to produce electricity. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about the capability just from a technical standpoint of whether they can be built. Again, I believe that Ontario is moving forward with a model to development. And again, the plants that I referred to in, I believe it's Wisconsin, they are repowering their existing reactor, and they intend, Holtec, as far as I know, intend to build SMRs, but they're not in development yet.
Yeah, if I can just jump
Sure.
in.
Sure.
I agree with everything the President just said. All that makes them really hard to finance. The uncertainty factor around how do you finance a development like that is just very, very high. One of the things I think that's helpful, the federal administration has made some, at least there's rumors, I don't know if there's an actual executive order around permit acceleration at the federal level, because time is a killer. So the last new nuclear to come online was Vogtle. It took 20 years from sort of start to finish.
Yes.
And was only 50 or 75% over budget by the time they got done, and that's tens of billions of dollars. So when we talk about ratepayer impact, like, holy cow, those challenges are very, very real, and that's federal permits, that's Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that's general capital markets appetite for those kinds of risks. So all of which is to say, I think this is a fertile area for exploration and looking at, but it's not a flip of a switch.
Yes, and totally agree, Mr. Sullivan, but you raise a great point. You mentioned permit acceleration, something that the federal government is looking into. Why haven't we been looking into something like that? And Madam President, to throw this to you, the Murphy administration has essentially put all its eggs in the wind basket for the past 7 years. And some may suggest it's noble as we look to develop clean energy. I agree with many of the statements you made about solar energy, but wouldn't you agree, Madam President, that the current cost crisis that we're in was foreseeable and preventable?
So I think, we certainly know and continue to try to develop more energy. The projections for demand growth have changed so drastically just in the last 2 years. The projections for PJM, primarily driven by data center growth throughout the region and throughout the country, have changed so dramatically. So, yes, we had been and continue to hope to plan to bring offshore wind generation to help to address the supply needs that we have, but those demand projections have really changed drastically because of data center growth.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that, but please, if you would, answer my question. Is the cost crisis that we're currently in, was it foreseeable and preventable?
So I don't think any of us were prepared for the auction results that we saw. Even with the demand projections, we know that the auction results in part are a result of generation resources not bidding into the market. Certainly that was not, we were not able to forecast generation resources that exist not bidding in and not being accounted for that way, which is really a primary driver of those increases.
Appreciate that, Madam President. So, in essence, you do not agree that the cost crisis that we're in was foreseeable and preventable. It's not an accurate statement.
I think it's accurate that we knew that we were going to see supply needs, I don't think that we in New Jersey could have anticipated that those auction results were going to be what they were.
Madam President, the reason I kept reiterating that particular statement, it's a quote from Governor Murphy on April 17, about a month ago. PJM responded to that quote by essentially saying to the governor, our governor, you worked for 7 years in promoting offshore wind, which really didn't deliver any results whatsoever. We wasted 7 years when we could have been expediting permits. We could have been studying nuclear. Today, as we're sitting here, the administration finally issued a request for information where we're looking to study nuclear. And I think, Madam President, there are 33 questions listed on that request for information that the governor just issued. Why don't we know the answers to those very basic questions already?
So I think, the support overall for nuclear has certainly been very clear in New Jersey, right? We have been very supportive of nuclear since the very beginning of this administration and ZECs. The fact that it is a carbon neutral resource and part of the clean energy mix around the country is really important to help us get to our goals. But certainly as Tim mentioned, there has not been a new reactor other than Vogtle developed in 30 years. I think since 3 Mile Island, there was not a reactor built, and that the Vogtle reactor took a very long time, longer than anticipated, and was significantly over budget. So I think there's been some caution around nuclear, rightfully, because of those issues.
Until today. But Madam President, isn't it true that in the 1970s, when Oyster Creek and the Salem Hope Creek reactors came online, there were actually federal approvals given to New Jersey for 2 additional reactors? Perhaps that's what the chairwoman was referring to, that were never developed. Don't we already have the ability to jumpstart our process by having federal approvals in place?
So yes, it's my understanding that there are approvals for a new reactor at Salem, where we have 3. That is not that's a federal regulation, the NRC. It's really up to the generation developer if they are going to build a new reactor. That is not something that we regulate because we don't regulate generation. So if they are going to build a new reactor, they do that without the regulatory authority of the BPU. I think there are a lot of conversations about bringing all new generation online for sure, but we can't. That it's not being done without ratepayer support. No company has come in and said they want to build a new reactor or any new large-scale generation like that, and they have not approached us for ratepayer support. That would most likely have to go through the legislature. I think there are conversations for sure, and they are definitely intensifying in terms of needing more generation and taking a serious look at bringing nuclear and new nuclear to New Jersey.
One of the important things, and the president mentioned this, the notion of having sufficiently available capital to even consider new nuclear generation is a relatively new phenomenon post, frankly, ChatGPT and the sort of realization, ChatGPT, AI. You saw Microsoft basically agreed to repower 3 Mile Island. Microsoft's a couple $1 trillion market cap company. To build new nuclear, so an offshore wind, the Ørsted capital costs were like $6-ish billion, right? For Ocean Wind 1. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars to build meaningful nuclear capacity. So the financing capability that is needed, that is not a government function, that is going to have to be a private sector function. Those conversations have only gotten real in the last 18 or so months nationwide. There are no SMRs deployed anywhere in the United States. Doesn't exist. It should. I'm all for it. But I think that this is a rapidly evolving, massively capital-intensive exercise that we're going to have to figure out how to get ahead of.
Mr. Sullivan, you raised some excellent points, but wasn't it just a couple of, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we subsidized nuclear power in Salem to make sure that we kept those plants operational?
So, Yes, but they are, that incentive, the ZEC incentive was for the existing reactors to maintain operation.
Correct. So there is precedent, though, for public money in New Jersey going to support nuclear power. We just need to expand it a little bit.
The nuclear incentive also was a cost, right? It is a cost that is coming to an end in terms of a charge on ratepayer bills, but it is still a cost to support those nuclear plants. And, to build a new reactor, as Tim mentioned, it's not something that can be funded exclusively by ratepayer funds because the cost of a new reactor is so significant.
I would agree wholeheartedly, but I think we have an obligation as a state, and you, Madam President, have an obligation as a president of the Board of Public Utilities to explore what we can do to expedite permitting, as the chairwoman has suggested, and what we can do to incentivize nuclear. At the beginning of your testimony, you mentioned specifically that by 2030, you would like to see wind account for New Jersey reaching its energy goals. I think we've been down that road and it doesn't work. Obviously there's going to be a new federal administration, but why are we wasting so much time when we can be taking advantage of the unique opportunity that is New Jersey to incentivize nuclear power? And Tim, feel free to weigh in on this. We have the federal permits that were put in place for 2 more plants from the 1970s. We've demonstrated that it works. 40% of our state continues to operate on nuclear power. Meanwhile, Mr. Sullivan, how much money are we throwing into the wind port in Paulsboro when we could be figuring out how to expedite permitting and incentivize Microsoft or whatever other companies to come here to New Jersey to build their AI centers?
Yeah, I don't think those are I think those are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the wind port would be one of the places that's on land right next to the Salem power plant, to the Hope Creek capacity. It's one of the places you would look at. And as we are exploring alternative uses of the wind port, this is a very front of mind topic. Let me put it that way. And the governor signed a piece of legislation last year allocating $500 million of tax credits to support AI infrastructure. Depends on what size project we're talking about. That's either a huge amount of money or a drop in the bucket. Because we're talking about a new nuke, you count in billions and you count fast.
Are we continuing to spend money on the wind port?
No, we've stopped.
We stopped?
We've completed phase 1. It's a beautiful wind port, but we're stopped for now.
Do you know how much money we invested as a state into that project?
A little more than $500 million.
$500 million? Okay, thank you.